Hello. Recently, I was asked to do a talk for the members of ArtCan about my 50 years working in arts administration. ArtCan is an organisation that supports emerging visual artists through a programme of exhibitions, workshops and other activities. And during this lockdown, they have been doing Saturday talks of various kinds. And I did one of these. That talk was not recorded, and since a number of people have asked me whether I would repeat the process, which is what I'm now doing. I left school in 1963 and got a job as a trainee architect with the Development Corporation, which was then building and developing Basildon Newtown in Essex. By 1969, I had decided that architecture was not for me, but because I was already employed by the Development Corporation, I was asked to take on the organisation of a sculpture exhibition, which grew into a large festival which happened in 1970. The festival included a number of arts or activities and programs, but was much more wide-ranging, including sports events, church services, an industrial exhibition, a whole range of activities. One of the highlights for me of that period was that because I was young and knew no better, I just telephoned people like Henry Moore and asked whether I could borrow some sculpture. And his office very kindly said, come and talk to the man himself. So I went and had lunch with Henry Moore, wandered round his garden, and he and I selected 3 works, which eventually came to Basildon as part of the festival. Following the, I guess, relatively successful outcome of the festival, the Development Corporation created a job for me which was called Community Development Officer with a special responsibility for the arts. The arts, in fact, was a relatively small part of the job, and a lot of the rest of the job was really not what I was looking to do. In 1969, in 1973, I applied for the job of Community Arts Officer for the London Borough of Wandsworth, and the principal task for that job was to work with the Borough Arts Officer, Mary Wolfe, in creating the new Battersea Arts Centre. And that's one of the projects I will come back to in a little while to talk about in a bit more detail. Following a few years running the Arts Centre, I moved to the Arts Council of Great Britain, as it then was, and became Assistant Housing the Arts Officer with responsibility for capital grants for new buildings and improvements to buildings, particularly art centres. Unfortunately, at the time I took up the post at the Arts Council, the government grant for that particular fund was cut, I think, by some 60%. So my director fairly soon after announced that he really thought that my job was not justifiable. They offered me various other posts within the Arts Council which really weren't suited to my areas of interest. So I was eventually made redundant. Fortunately, at that same time, I was in contact with most of the regional arts associations, and the London office asked me about becoming a temporary visual arts officer while their visual arts officer was off on long-term sick leave. So I moved to Greater London Arts, responsible for arts in all 32 London boroughs. I did a stint as visual arts officer, a stint as music officer, then as an assistant to the director, and finally the post of assistant director was created, which I was appointed to with specific responsibility for the funding and development of art centres in London and liaising with local authorities. So, following almost 9 years at Greater London Arts, I decided it was time to look around and think about moving on. I couldn't really find any job that I really wanted to do next. I didn't want to be director of a regional arts association. I didn't want to go back to running an art centre. But at that time, there was the beginnings of people working on a freelance basis as consultants to various projects, particularly around new buildings. Peter Stark, who had run Bracknell South Hill Park Art Centre, was doing a project with High Wycombe District Council and asked me to join him to look at the designs for a project which would, strangely enough, convert yet another Victorian town hall into an art centre. That was the beginnings of working as a consultant, and brought together my previous experience in studying architecture together with the experience of running buildings and working for funding bodies. So it was a pretty good kind of combination of skills and experience. Most of the work that I then did was around buildings in one form or another, including some new buildings such as Chequer Mead Theatre and Art Centre in East Grinstead, the Maltings Art Centre in Berwick-upon-Tweed, the Oakwood Centre in Woodley. There was also a number of conversions of buildings from previous uses into art centres, including the Mick Jagger Centre in Dartford, which was school buildings, the Red Brick Theatre in Blackburn, and the mill buildings in Bradford that were part converted to house Mind the Gap Theatre Company. In addition to conversions, there was also a number of upgrading of existing buildings, including Salisbury Arts Centre, which I'll come back to again in a moment, Fairfield Halls in Croydon, and the King's Theatre in Southsea. An important factor in the development of a lot of those buildings was the introduction of the National Lottery in 1994. And in the early days, all of that money was dedicated to capital investment in arts buildings and arts projects. So that was a major boost to that area of work. In addition to the building-based projects, I was also involved in a number of other types of work, business planning, project development for existing arts organisations, board development for organisations, and those included organisations such as the International Children's Festival in Edinburgh, Key Art Centre on the Isle of Wight, and a number of others. Also, at the same time, there was developments within local authorities. So, together with other people, I worked on a number of arts development plans for local authorities, including Gloucester City, Gloucestershire County Council, Surrey County Council, Richmond-upon-Thames, North Yorkshire County Council, and so on. So, during 30 plus years as an arts consultant, I've now worked in every English region and done a couple of projects in Scotland and I think a couple in Wales. As a result, there are some 25 plus buildings around the country that exist as a result of some involvement by myself alongside other consultants and, of course, a number of architects who have actually designed the buildings or designed the upgrades. I wanted to talk a bit about a couple of projects in a bit more detail. Firstly, Battersea Arts Centre. For those of you who don't know, it's a very grand Victorian town hall built in 1897. I should know that date, but I don't. As a result of the reorganisation of local government in London in the 1970s, it became redundant when Battersea was amalgamated into Wandsworth. The building remained empty and unused for quite some years. It was then put up for sale, and the sale was about to go through when there was a change of power within Wandsworth Council. The Labour Party took control, and part of their campaign was to give Battersea Town Hall back to the people. And the job that Mary Wolfe and I had to do was to then work out precisely what that meant. Interestingly, it was always called a community arts centre, and I mean that was very much our focus, to make it an arts centre that served local people. It was much more concerned with participation, education work, as well as performances and exhibitions and cinema showings and so on. We didn't have a significant programming budget, so instead we offered space to a number of theatre companies who in return gave us free performances and free workshops. One of the interesting bits of the staffing setup was that we had 5 general assistants, and because of the number of people that applied for those jobs, we were able to choose 5 who, between them, had some skill in most of the art forms, drama, music, and visual arts in particular. So their jobs developed into being much more concerned with running workshops, doing activities after school for local children. But they were very wide-ranging jobs, ranging from putting the seats out, hanging exhibitions, occasionally cleaning the toilets, right the way through to being very much more involved in the creative processes of the Arts Centre. Some years later, the Arts Centre was closed by the Conservative Council in Wandsworth. They had always seen it as a Labour Party project. At that point, I was Assistant Director of Greater London Arts, and I became part of the team of both local people and people from the wider arts community that put together the rescue package that resulted in the centre being now run by a trust, which it's now been doing for many years very successfully. The next project I wanted to talk to you about is Hackney Empire. By far the biggest project that I have worked on. The original theatre was built in 1901 by Frank Matcham, one of the great theatre architects, who in his 40-odd years of career managed to build at least one theatre every year. And Hackney Empire was completed in 1 year, from initial concept to first performance, which is pretty amazing. It took a great deal longer to do the restoration. I think probably 4 or 5 years in total. It, like most of these theatres, went through a very checkered history, ending up as a Mecca bingo hall. But in the 1980s, it was taken over by a community arts team who started to program it, although the building was not in great condition. But they developed a very successful program, again, very much relating to the local communities. The capital project, which ended up costing £17 million, included a complete restoration of the historic parts of the building, the addition of workshop spaces, and the building of a whole new stage house at the back of the theatre. and the Hackney Empire now continues to operate, or at least we hope it continues to operate once our current crisis is over. And finally, I just wanted to briefly talk about Salisbury Arts Centre, mainly because I spent so much time working with them, which was always very interesting and very enjoyable. The Art Centre is housed in a redundant church, partly Elizabethan, but like most churches, very largely Victorian. It started to be used as an art centre in the mid-70s as part of the Salisbury Festival, took on a life of its own. At some point, the local authority decided that they could no longer afford to support it. There was, at that point, a huge campaign, by far the biggest public campaign that Salisbury had seen at that point, which resulted in a rescue package, and I was commissioned to help them develop the business plan that would support that reopening. And then some years later, I was brought back in to help them develop all of the business planning and other information that supported the upgrading of the building and the building of an extension. The building of the extension became quite an interesting additional bit of work, something you don't expect to do when you're involved in arts administration, which was the removal of historic graves, which requires a process which is positively medieval and does in fact go to the Queen, and you get letters back from the Home Secretary saying you're allowed to do these things. So you never know what you're going to bump into when you're doing an arts project. Just a couple of things to finish off. There's a kind of underlying theme, I think, and I hope, in all of the work that I've done, which is about creating new opportunities for all kinds of people to be involved in the arts, not just as audiences or viewers of work created by others, but active involvement in learning about the arts, participating in the arts, creating their own work, working alongside professionals and community artists and others, so that the arts become much more ingrained in the life of the communities that these buildings and other projects are aiming to serve. Finally, at the very beginning, I said I'm chair of the trustees of ArtCan. I'm also chair of the trustees of Streatham Space Project, a new small-scale theatre and general arts building purpose-built as part of a planning game scheme in Streatham. Since leaving the funding system, I have been on the boards of a number of arts organisations. I've always benefited from others being on boards and committees in supporting and advising me, and I feel it's an important part of giving back to the system that those of us that can put in our voluntary efforts to support organisations through being board members or general advisors. I think that's it. In the original version, there was then a lot of questions and quite a lot of debate, but that's clearly not going to happen in this version. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it of some interest, and if any of you wish to contact me to discuss it further, please do. Thank you.